the things that my son Dave and I have discovered about the nature of practice is that in over a dozen episodes throughout the nearly 300 episodes of the Practice Podcast, there's always something new for Dave and Dad to discuss, to learn about, and in my case, to learn from Dave. And he's prepared, in this instance, a set of slides to illustrate what he is going to teach me, thereby teaching you. So Dave, welcome to the Practice Podcast.
Thanks. And this is, we were going to do our podcast just on a Q&A type conversation, but then we got one comment where someone was wondering how to apply social inaction to therapy. And that set me off on taking my early work on my master's research on shame and social emotions and trying to resurrect it a bit, and then tying it into a therapy method that I learned about and that I've been trying lately, and one that's also been somewhat popular in the YouTube circles I've been following, such as John Vervaeke, called internal family systems, and then also, and really while I was working on this, I learned that my mentor, Thomas Scheff, passed away just last May at age 95. And he was my mentor in learning social bonds and shame and applying it to talk and interaction. And was, on my master's committee and dissertation committee. So this is in honor of him, because with this internal family systems, I think I'll refer to a particular practitioner who I think solved some of the problems with shame theory, or some of the missing points that will, I think, explain how the family of shame emotions is distinctly human, and the basis of I think how we are both social selves and individual selves, and maybe fundamental to even how language works. So I'm going to try to do a slideshow again, which may on I probably don't have the best format for YouTube where you can actually see it, because it's probably too many words and things, but at least I used AI to come up with some images to illustrate things.
And for the listeners who are only in audio right now, if they want to find the video with the slides, we'll be putting those on our YouTube channel, looking at for just the word Fearon will get you there. But yeah, and it also helps me as a learner to see your slides as you talk me through it.
Okay. So this will be one quick thing we can do is turn off our videos. All right, so they don't show up on the screen, and hopefully we're just recording the slides and still hear each other. So this will be a presentation. Hopefully we can do it within an hour on the concept that our talks have been on: social inaction, and then social bonds, and how they relate to emotions and the self. And this will be we'll be looking at how it kind of relies on following past talks, which are all on a nice YouTube playlist, and on our website, where I've been talking about how a particular way of approaching human communication I call enacted social action, how it also enacts social bonds, or which is another word for social relationships, but a more embodied and direct sense, but also one that connects to more abstract ideas of what a relationship is. And I'm going to start with my favorite um, pragmatist philosopher, George Herbert Mead, building upon his theories, but then looking at how maybe social emotions evolved as a special composite of the core emotions that other animals share, certainly all mammals. And then uh, these particular composite emotions are what my mentor Tom Scheff called the shame family of social emotions, which include guilt and embarrassment, and also the positive emotions of pride, um, and how that works for social bonds. And I'm going to kind of summarize a little bit of my master's research findings, but also extend those findings, drawing in this area of uh, psychology therapy method, internal family systems, and then end with if we have time, with a wide concept of how mind, self, and society have what I call a Janus point, looking inwards and outwards, in order to explain the nature of consciousness. So um, that should be plenty to work with for this talk. Um,
Yeah, it's going to be rich. Let's get
so
right into it.
yeah, so um, how is it that social, what I'm calling social inaction, enacts social bonds? I wanted to show how a relationship is more than just something we talk about, or a kind of a symbolic, abstract sense, but it's something that's embodied and done, and emotions are a crucial part of that. But also, it's literally how self and other become enacted as a realized thing in our worlds. So, just the brief overview of what I mean by social inaction. I draw from three of its common definition meanings. So, enacting is to perform, especially within conversation or talk and interaction. It's the acts of orienting talk to what each participant would find mutually understandable and relevant to each other. So each person becomes the audience of the other, and in doing so, they bring forth through this performance the topics, the categorizations of people's things, events, and in maintaining that mutual understanding, and even who oneself and other are within that domain. And then, but also enacting is like to act from authority. You can warrant what you're doing, and hold each other accountable based on whatever anyone ought to know about talk. Just having grown up in a world where you didn't invent the words, but they were built socially. So having to make everything you say and do relevant to its social context. Um, and part of this, uh, I'll argue, is accountability to being social, and the social other is part of maintaining one's ongoing social relationship through talk. So, George Herbert Mead, I like to start with as kind of what I call the second generation of the American pragmatist philosophers, in the late um, 1800s, early 20th century, um, developed a range of theories, including description of the act, the social act, but also acts that would be common to other animals, as a way of explaining what is different about human interaction that sets them apart from other interacting species. But all animals, he he argued, have acts are kind of a series of somewhat overlapping and interacting parts. But at the basis of an act, he argued, is emotion, what he called the impulse, an emotional basis of initiating or either initiating a new act or interrupting a prior act and starting a new one. Always that basis of emotion. And with the impulse comes perception, kind of looking around for relevance, recognition based on prior experience and what you see in your context, and also a highly a predictive nature of perception, um, so which is very relevant to the in today's theories of cognition. This idea of predictive processing, and then manipulation is the acts, the sensory to motor sequences where you might move things in the real world or even think things through as a way of potentially resolving that impulse, and then consummation as the resolution, if it comes, of a particular act, but also something that's evaluative, a learning moment to learn how did that resolution of the impulse go and what should you be predicting the next time around. So you could see this for other animals. The acts of other animals, and one thing is any part of the act is, I think, always socially oriented. It's something that isn't just a simple computer program in the brain. It's something that evolves as solutions to being with other animals within your species, or other animals that you're trying to eat or are escaping being eaten by. All of these become potential impulses. And some impulses then become relevant in defining within a species, like what does your species find to be food? And then um, perception then becomes to, follow your social family, learning the young animal, like the little ducks, learn to see what their mother eats. Um, Manipulation is the act of actually following through and learning what kind of acts lead to nutrition, to safety, to play, to other ways of resolving the impulse, and then consummation as this learning moment, and really learning outside the innate abilities of any animal, and even slightly more complex animals than amoebas start to learn outside of their innate abilities. And by the time you have birds and mammals, they are building acts based on um, increasing flexibility and complexity of how they can deal with the world based on the acts. So one very brief idea I like about Mead's definition of acts is the act itself is sort of like an entity. It's self-contained. You could kind of think of it as a computer program, but I like to think of it as more of almost a little living organization that's born with the impulse, has to adjust by its perception and manipulation, and then in a way kind of dies or goes away with consummation and then becomes something else. Um, so this is we'll just kind of keep in the back of our mind this entity-like notion of the act. But for Mead, his philosophy of the social act was one that built off of this basic format into something that might explain the evolution of language, and not just language, but the social self. Um, and this you could see in most social animals, cats and dogs, birds, that are using their calls. They all have calls and certain gestures that are there because they are shortcuts of predictive acts. The dog growls. The growl anticipates a potential attack. The attack is can be recognized by other dogs, and it comes to be recognized by um, the prey of a dog or other animals. So what Mead calls this predictive uh, aspect of the gesture, he calls its meaning. The meaning is um, the anticipation of a future act that becomes essentially symbolic within the gesture itself. And part of this is emotions. Emotions with other directive impulse to consummation becomes kind of what defines these particular gestures that animals tend to use. And another aspect of that is it's a self-referencing. There's a self-referencing nature to the gesture. It's my adjustment to another, and especially a social other, be another animal of my species, my family, or an external animal, or things in the world that might be animals. The rustling of a bush that might be an attacker. Um, so we're orienting towards our worlds as these distinctions of self, and also the extension. Once you have this self-other extension, it can extend into kind of broader groups. The siblings, the flock, the herd, and also an ongoing relevance to their survival. And this idea of the social group both being abstract, being something that has meaning, potentially almost symbolic in a sense, but also one that requires survival is something that will be a theme that we'll kind of build upon. So as um, language evolved, one thing that Mead points out is that the vocal gesture is a particular sort of gesture that may lead to language. Basically, the vocal gesture is, I make a call, I can hear the call the same, more or less the same way another person hears it. And so, my hearing my own vocal gestures and the meaning, distinctive meaning and categorization of those gestures become recursive and they become defining of various social situations. And so within a group doing this, it becomes, a whole set of mutual meanings around certain vocal acts, vocal in particular. Um, so what uh, Mead referred to as symbolic interaction emerges from these varying acts, situations, and also the social relationships in which they're embedded as recursive and becoming increasingly abstracted, so that one instance will one instance of a gesture will serve for a variety of situations and also be something that could be pieced together in ways that sentences are, words and phrases. And given that it requires this social agreement for the symbols to work at all, you can't make up your own. They have to be ones that others can use. This reinforces the need for social bonds or relationships within the groups that are using these gestures. So, and this quickly becomes more than just a family group inventing their own gestures. You get tribes, larger clusters, and even societies that eventually make languaging something that works for the widest variety of situations. And at the brain level, this I think I've seen some studies where they're kind of looking at how parts of the brain that use spatial temporal navigation, pointing to things in the world, are part of what becomes functional in the symbolic world too. You start to see in speech metaphors of closeness and distance from others in a literal sense, the same way we might experience the social distance of an object, the social distance of the people can kind of be um, part of that abstracted domain as well. And an important part of this type of symbolic interaction is that you get a different type of self and a different type of other that emerge as not just direct experiences, but as symbolic themselves. And so this is something that is different than what other animals can experience. You have to have something like a human that can do sustained symbolic and conversational interaction. What Mead says is that you actually get two types of self, the I and the me. And the me is what is the new thing. It you get something that evolves as a social object. So an object is something that um, is kind of what you talk about, what is a category, what you can indicate, but it's always something that's realized within some sort of social act or an orientation uh, with relevance realized within the talk itself. So it's something that emerges in that sense. So you have a self as a me, a social object, um, and as you develop the me from childhood, that may actually form before you can speak, the difference between yourself and your caretakers. But as you start learning words, you learn to fit the me to different social situations and especially different expectations of others. So you are gradually socialized to internalize your role in relation to others and what other people do, maybe people who are different to yourselves, the adults, the people you see on TV, and also particular capacity of children and of humans is to be able to take the role of another. In other words, be able to imaginatively um, live and understand how another person is as though it were myself. And so Mead and other social psychologists of the time talked of this, the evolving and actually child development of being able to orient to from specific others to generalize others. So a generalized other might be the baseball team or the workplace or um, taxes or various other social inventions that one can kind of orient towards being and even representing. So you could quickly see how with the evolve evolution of the me through language, you get social norms and their perpetuation, and also social organization. So that's why one of Mead's book is Mind, Self, and Society, growing out of this process. Now, just being able to have the me as an object doesn't mean I no longer have this feeling of who I am, this subjective self consciousness, this awareness. Like how am I not just all the roles I play? There's still this sense of what Mead calls the I, the subjective experience itself is still there. It's still something we experience as the immediacy of adjusting to others' expectations, and also constraining ourselves to others' expectations and also the internalized expectations that I'm expressing in my various experiences of me. So I need to do what my parents say is something where I am constraining my impulse to do things on the basis of the symbolic representation of the specific and generalized others. So, so we can, so you could think of the I as being the where we would feel our feelings, pain, where we'd feel emotions, where we feel hunger, and where we would actually experience cognition in all its forms, like sight and sound. But within this is a new kind of emergent interaction between the I and the me. And this new symbolic interaction then becomes a way of having a social constraint and a social relevance in a social relationship as mattering for my own internal experiences. And other animals can't do this in a sustained way. So, Mead had a nice, I think, well-formed idea of how emotions and social society could develop in this way. I think one question, though, is whether as humans become language users and language becomes the core of more complex and abstract social organization, are emotions still there? Are they needed? Are they still at the basis of even how talk works? And I think it's easy to neglect that, and it certainly was neglected, maybe still is to a degree in cognition and psychology and even linguistics, that emotion is still part of talk, and also that social relationships are also crucial to talk. So I'm going to kind of focus our argument building up to that. Um, within the self, you still have emotion-based impulses coming from largely these social acts and gestures. Um, with the I as direct experiences of the feelings and the expression of the feelings, and then the me as a way of constraining affect and also interpreting emotions, and doing this through talking externally, but also through self-talk. We talk to ourselves about what we feel. Um, so one question is, are the are we talking about just the basic emotions, fear and anger? Or maybe some people have suggested that more specialized emotions also evolved along with symbolic language, self, and society. And I'm one of those people. I believe that a different sort of emotion type did evolve. Um, and we can call this as social emotions as composites. So what are these composite emotions? Here's a couple slides kind of harkening back to some of our earlier discussions that kind of bring together some of the parts of this. One is from episode 191. We talked about Dr. Mark Solms' work, where he makes a great argument that emotions are actually the basis of subjective consciousness. What is consciousness? What is conscious awareness? It's nothing without emotions, and really something that's originating in the brainstem in a sense, and not the cortex, because it's coming from there and then going through the limbic system, that the you get this differentiation of emotions, which I think is directly what Mead might refer to as the impulse. And from there, the brain is putting the rest of the social act together from its relevance, meaning, memory, and such. So, Solms could argue then that emotions is still the foundation of mental life. It's never distinct. It's never separated from anything we do. Um, and subjectivity then emerges from this integration of affect and action. And this is what the cortex is doing in very complex ways, but that brainstem is still there and really generating that sense of self. And I would say generating that sense of the I, and then the me is emerging from that. And just briefly, he lays out from other people's work what he calls 7 core emotion systems, and I want to bring these together because from this I want to argue that the shame family is a composite of all of these potentially. He says that seeking is actually a type of emotion. You're seeking for what you expect. Curiosity is rather distinct. Anger in its forms, various forms such as rage and frustration. Fear in its forms like anxiety or terror. Lust as base sexual desire, which can become um, more of a basis of other types of affection. Grief, which is kind of a separation distress, but also can a type of panic base. And also play, which is I'll talk about as well, is a very particular emotion that's very focused on social interaction. Um, One other group talk I did, episode 200, I talked about Dr. Ian McGilchrist's uh, groundbreaking work on hemispheres in the brain. That the left and right hemisphere um, are very uh, distinct in particular ways of having distinct, almost distinct cells, where the left hemisphere is focused on tasks and categories, categorization of the world, manipulation, sort of the manipulation phase of the acts, finding things to grab, take, eat, fight. Um, or for humans categorize and make sense of. And so it's very language focused in that sense. But then the right hemisphere is doing other work. It's actually focused on the brighter, where the left half the brain is focused on very particular things it needs. The right part of the brain is more general, focused on the context of things that might sneak up on you and attack you if you're an animal, but also is looking for novelty, doing evaluation, bringing in broader context. And the corpus callosum is a relatively narrow bunch of fibers that connects the two. It's really in a more conversational way than fully integrating the two of them. So, in a real sense, there may be at least two selves, I's and me's, doing very distinct things, but interacting in somewhat of a conversational way. And some of the split plane studies where the corpus callosum is broken really show this autonomous nature. And I'm raising this in part because we're going to talk about the idea of a much more distinct autonomy to various selves than even Ian McGilchrist thought of. So just briefly, the hemispheres, it's not so much that each one is specialized for emotion, but they make use of the limbic system emotions somewhat differently, with the left hemisphere largely taking the emotions and analyzing them, categorizing them, talking about them, and sometimes also trying to control them or bypass the feeling rather than feel them directly. When there is pain, you can talk yourself out of it. So, but it does tend to focus on anger, anxiety, defensiveness, and even kind of a more moralistic um, broadening of those categories. While the right hemisphere, it's more the I experience, to where the left is focused on the me aspects of self. You're feeling the raw embodied emotions, processing them within their immediate context, and more of the immediate feelings of sadness, grief, empathy, um, context of thinking about others, fear, and more adaptive ways, and joy may be more right hemisphere oriented. Um, but I think um, what I haven't seen a lot of emotion studies really make a strong case for two things about emotions: that they are largely oriented to social domain for social animals, and also that all emotions are communicative. And I think they're communicative even for as soon as anything evolved that could be uh, conceived of as having feelings, which could be, single cell organisms. The emotions are doing something. They're basically broadcasting some state to other states, initially the brain and the body, um, that doesn't have a direct wiring, so it kind of needs a broadcast type of emotion of the impulse. Something's gone wrong, do something about it. So um, more complex subjective feelings are part of this. So you have a top-down assessment, um, which, in the sense that your social, your experience of the world, you're going through the world, you see something startling. Um, this becomes an impulse in Mead's definition, funneled right down to the brainstem. The brainstem uh, takes the complex world and turns it into valence, good, bad, threat, not threat. Um, Evokes some of these core emotion systems, and then the rest of the brain has to go back up and kind of make sense around this. This is kind of a communication, a kind of, I think, a conversation among parts of the brain. Um, and as that complexity evolved with social complexity among animal species and with humans, um, at currently the most complex as language users on our planet. Um, I think the that social nature is still there too. So you have this um, coevolution of emotions with this communicative function that's visual. We have gestures. Other animals have gestures, and gestures are still a big part of language as well. Hand gestures, prosody, making one's voice go up. What do you mean? In a question tone. It's still all there, and it does its work. Um, so, uh, basically, I think we should not be surprised that um, emotions are a core of interaction, they're a core of cognition, they're a core of social relationships. Um, so, how does this all come together? Here, I um, am going to kind of start working in the work of Tom Scheff,
Yeah.
um, and his wife, who did a lot of the early research, Suzanne Retzinger, on shame and social bond theory. And I won't say too much about where it came from, but it was around by the late 80s, early 90s. He was building this work based on his own training and work in the earlier sociological social psychologists who were themselves inspired by George Herbert Mead and others. A few names would be Irving Goffman was one, several others. Mead being one of them, um, and the symbolic interactionists. But he was also bringing in some psychology, psychotherapy, therapeutic work at the time, such as family systems theory, Virginia Satir, and others, looking at how this mattered for emotions and how talk mattered for making uh, psychotherapy work as a therapeutic. And particular psychotherapists for who one of the few and early ones who focused on shame and guilt was Helen Block Lewis, who wrote some early books in the early 80s. Um, and I'll kind of bring in her concepts of overt and bypass shame. But really, there's been very little research or therapy on shame and guilt either then or now. It's still not a lot of research. Tom Scheff always said it's a dangerous thing to research because people seem to be ashamed of talking about it or researching it or making claims. So it's an odd thing. It's a uh, he always said it's a good way to not get published um, is to study shame and maybe I took that to heart because after I finished my master's thesis and did my dissertation on, I turned to enacted this enacted social action idea, really focusing on the communication, but kind of pushed the shame and emotions part back a bit. So now I'll fill in some of those blanks all these years later.
Good.
Um, so um, so let's keep going. So I'm going to make the argument now again of this idea of composite, that shame and the shame family, which I'll define in a bit, are a composite of lots of these more base emotions because all of these base emotions have a both an internal self focus, but also a social communication focus. And when they can all come together through language and talk and interaction and more complex social bonds. So fear being the first one, kind of this of the negative emotions, um, you experience internally as uh, impulse for flight or self protection with the potential of being destroyed as a self. Maybe the end state is to be killed. So there's a real existential sense of fear. And maybe the survival becomes one of the core predictive impulses, and even the brain orienting around using fear for that reason. So that's always going to be there. But on the social side of fear, it's important to be able to indicate fear to others through social gestures. So, showing the relevance of what's dangerous in the world, it matters not just for your individual existence, but the group. If you're part of a family or a tribe, Um, and so fear becomes kind of a social act or social object in that sense, or gesture could be a call for others to protect. The tribe gathers together and fights the threat. But you can even have fear become even more symbolic. Um, the fearful generalized others, like the enemy becomes, or the stories told about fearful things become part of the socialization of fear at this broader level. Um, Anger is another a negative emotion, which has on the self-experiential side more of the fight orientation, the attack, having to do with a lot, boundary violations, where fear isn't a solution, fight is the other option. Destruction of the other as an end state, but you're putting yourself at risk, um, in a sense, risk of isolating yourself from the other. Um, and there's a sense of kind of self-effacing nature, I think, with anger, um, where you kind of abandoning that self-protection to some degree in order to attack the other. So, um, as a social gesture, one can fight for the group, maybe sacrifice oneself for the group. But there's also anger is a way of distancing, your part of the group from another group, removing others from that group, and then also kind of binding yourself to the side you're on. If you're angry, you're making that choice of uh, binding yourself both to risking or sacrificing yourself to the group, but also um, you know, choosing sides, having solidarity around one side or another, using anger as a way of pushing to those boundaries. Um, so the gestures uh, can be, the growl, the shout, predictive of an attack, or of more specific things you're angry about when you have language. Um, Grief is another base emotion, kind of on the negative side. You experience, lots of animals actually do experience this sense of loss. Separation from the group or from their maternal support is a particular sort of feeling system. It releases, you could kind of you release the support of the animal, the caretaking animal that raised you. But there's also a sense of self-sacrifice. The animal that's been totally separated from its herd, or will actually at first make a sound like a baby animal will make a sound of crying to get its mother to find it, but then at a certain point it stops. It kind of gets, because the cry distracts predators to the animal that's lost and can no longer be returned to the group. That sense of despair is almost an emotional survival of sacrificing the individual for the group. And I think this kind of can go into the more social complex gestures as well. You're releasing the supporting others for those you grieve about, but you can find social others for support, for those who remain. And it kind of uh, so that shared recognition of the lost member of society is important. Um, so uh, from for the cry from being about yourself directed away from the herd becomes more of a cry about members of your tribe or social group who are gone. So grief is certainly there and has that social aspect to it. And even disgust has a social aspect. Disgust is like the rejection of food that you don't expect to be bad. Uh, it could actually be abstracted to events or situations that you might be disgusted about that have that immediate rejection um, of what's improper, what's impure, what's not edible. In the social world, Um, People still have that gesture of exaggerated facial expressions that tell others what not to eat, what they expected to be sweet wasn't, or it's rotten. That becomes easily um, turned into more abstracted objects, the kind of from the group recognition of someone rejecting food or rejecting other objects can become at a collective level rejection more abstractly. What is it to reject? Um, Reject individuals from a group, reject ideas from the norms of a group, um, and reject the impure that threatens the norms of a group. So you get things like boundaries of what's expected or not, what's accountable, what's a stigma. These kind of have aspects of that disgust, raw emotion in there as well. So you can see all these parts. There's also on the positive side, we should speak about play. This is one that Mark Solms, I first kind of saw him use this idea. I think he got it from others, but play being another particular positive experience that for the self, basically, you'll see animals play. They'll play, kittens will play at catching mice or catching whatever, play fighting. Um, you're practicing skills and mostly social skills without the danger of, actual destruction of fighting, without the risks of losing your food by practicing how to get food. So play is really important for social interaction and social learning. And I think there's a pleasure side to it, a very particular pleasure side, which might be called joy. And I think we experience it more as joy in a so in more complex social world. Uh, Part of what we call role taking, taking the roles of the other, becomes a coordination of social actions that is often used in plays. Kids play baseball. They take the role of the person at first base, who's pitching, who's catching. This becomes something that kids learn and it helps develop their brains and expands into other, all sorts of social roles that one learns, one's practices, and also the boundaries of relevance between what's play and what's real, what's a joke and what's serious. Um, and I think there's lots of kind of gestures that evolve into conversations, refined to operate as play, and also feelings that surround it could be joy, um, and also potentially pride. Um, and I think you could kind of call love as a evolution of positive emotions, starting from just kind of the lust or sexual or mating feelings, but also expanding into what's beyond this level of pleasure to just a secure support, of a parent among young animals, belonging within a group, within a herd, within a family. Um, and so you get more complexity to the feelings that lead to, in the social world, maybe feelings more of a solidarity, from the parent, child nurturing protection to the group protection of the individual, um, the returning of being away from a bond back to the secure bond for the you know for the baby. Mating calls become much more refined in the human social world as courting sequences, um, and love songs and everything else that you have. And then, so I think love can become complexified into friendships, the feelings around respect, feelings around admiration, kind of this agape love definition of the group, um, solidarity. So, so there's negatives, there's positives, but I want to argue that all of these evolve together into a composite. In this composite, I'm using what Tom Scheff calls the shame family of emotions, sets of emotions, um, that developed, again, kind of using this spatial sense of relationship to others, this closeness and distance being more than just a metaphor, but really even the brain is working towards turning the other distance, being away out of the group and moving back towards the group as what we could think of as existential in the sense that my I, me has to be connected to others in order to exist. And to the extent that some sort of connection is threatened, my very survival as an I, me self is threatened. I could die in the sense that without at least something social, I no longer exist physically, but also I no longer, like, all of a sudden no one can understand what I say, or I can't understand what they say. Your sense of self starts to dissolve. People with certain strokes probably have this experience. Um, so there's a real sense in which I think this composite emotions needs to be there for this quality of relationship to be maintained or threatened. And there's always an orientation of social acts around that. And maybe there's always a component of any social act to have a social relationship that may be maintained or threatened as part of the social act itself, both its impulse, its adjustments, its evaluation, and its outcome. So we can kind of look at um, how some of these like the negative emotions in particular, I think are ones that fit into this composite shame family where fear, the social context of rejection from the family or tribe, corresponds to a self experience, a felt anxiety of removal of social safety at the extreme end of dissolving or being killed as a self. Grief is also in there, the sorrow for those who are rejected, the sorrow of being rejected. There's a real feeling from a loss of security. It feels like dying, and maybe panic is actually something that's at the extreme of that becomes part of this composite. And then despair, if you're really rejected with no possibility of repair of the social bond or returning to the secure bond of the group or tribe, um, the self-experience side of that may have correspond to something like hiding, removing oneself, self-dissolution, irredeemable rejection becomes part of that kind of the painful edge of despair if that becomes part of this social emotion. Um, Anger becomes maybe a way of bypassing or controlling those feelings. Anger towards those who are rejected. It's a way of expelling people from your social group or justifying a distance. Um, Rage, anger, reject those who reject you as a solution for the painful feelings of being rejected. And then even disgust, this idea of stigma, things and objects that are can't be consumed and must be rejected. There's this feeling, experiential side of distaste, um, of that which is rejected. So I think disgust has this aspect of rejecting others. That's felt. That's a part of this pain, but also the idea of then of this being um, all mixed together with language and its complexity gives you something that's uniquely human. That um, like chimps and apes, they you could see a lot of this. We just saw like Jane Goodall who recently passed away. Her I think 2019 National Geographic did a great documentary, and you could see with the chimpanzee groups that she studied, all of these emotions are there. But I think when you add language to it, you get much more sustained orientation to this composite emotion, which I call bond threat context. Um, so the bond threat, uh, social bond threat, what manifests as you experience social relationships. You'll have lots of little things in talk, like making errors in your acts, social acts, or your speech that are accountable. They're accountable because you have to make an account for why you did it incorrectly, why you did something someone didn't understand. And this actually, if you look closely at speech, I think becomes a composite part of it, people orienting to mutual understanding, not just for the kind of computer like sense, oh, you must understand me, but that there's a real emotional consequence to not being mutually understood. And this more broadly becomes like social role violations, the need to conform, the punishment of nonconformity, and also, of course, power, the idea of others having more control over your actions than you do yourself in certain situations. And so, shifting of power, shifting of social hierarchies, social orders, these can become threats that one experiences to the immediate bond or social relationship. Disrespect is another one. Respect and disrespect is another common term, and also moral judgments. Um, these become threats. And there's also a concept, Emil Durkheim, one of the early sociologists, used the term anomie, a feeling of normlessness, a feeling that you're in a world that you no longer understand, like a new political administration comes in, and all of a sudden, none of the things that I thought were right seem to be a priority anymore. So you get this feeling of normlessness. It becomes kind of a social relationship threat that we experience in the general sense. So any of these threats can trigger the shame family um, complex composite emotions. And so these the main types of shame family emotions are embarrassment, guilt, shaming of others, and shamed, feeling ashamed, a state of being shamed. So there's kind of two aspects of shame: shaming others and feeling shame yourself. All of these are this shame family. Um, and so you can kind of see kind of levels of mild to extreme in the shame family that these terms fit. But a lot of them have very particular gestures. So there's two types, and this comes back to the work of Helen Block Lewis, where she defined the difference between overt shame, kind of the felt shame, and the shown shame, and the bypassing or suppressing of shame, both its visible gesture signals and even the internal feelings that you feel. So overt shame, you could see very characteristic things people do. They blush. If you're embarrassed, you blush, you lower your eyes, you see people touching, covering the face somehow, the face in particular, and also things like nervous giggles. All of these are kind of an overt expression of shame that other people can see. And one of the reasons it's social is other people should be able to do something about it. And we'll talk a bit about what that is. But basically, if people can see you be ashamed, they may have the opportunity to repair the cause of the shame, which is generally a repair of the quality of the social bond, social relationship of that moment, if they recognize what you're shamed about. But a lot of situations, you can't expect people to repair the bond for you, or just if you're often feeling shame, kids quickly learn to bypass those feelings. It's just you can't sustain that feeling forever. So bypassing are actions that will both not let other people recognize that you're ashamed and also help control your own internal feelings of it. So some of these are things that disrupt thoughts and speech. Disruptive speech, you'll see people stutter and stammer, kind of jerky motions, uh, even dissociated thoughts or numbness, really people trying to kind of wrench themselves into another way of understanding the situation that they felt ashamed about. And one common way to do this is anger or rage. Just twist the shame towards from yourself to shaming others, rejecting others, justifying that social distance that shame is brought up. So um, that's overt and bypass shame. Um, and then so these could be kind of various levels. The embarrassment would be kind of a lower level of shame where we all have little common social transactions. You drop your books on the floor in front of the kids at school. Um, Kids at school could say, well, oh, this could happen to everyone. Anyone could do this. You could overt blush, but you can also laugh, and then the kids can laugh with you. And it becomes a shared social adjustment in which everyone can kind of take the role of each other. And embarrassment is something that is typically and ideally brief and goes away, and you feel better about yourself afterwards. Um, Guilt is often defined more specifically around the social situations that it's where in a social context you're doing something wrong and you realize you're doing something wrong, doing something accountable, assessing your own behavior, and then allowing by showing some recognition or sign that you have guilt, others can then acknowledge this call for empathy and compassion, and others can then help repair what makes you guilty. So you admit you do something wrong. Ideally, your parents say, well, you admitted you did something wrong. That's great. We forgive you. So guilt and embarrassment are kind of the more the repairable bond threats. Um, they're there to generate others' concern and empathy for you, a way of a social occasion to acknowledge each other's feelings and an urge to repair the relationship. So that's a nice socially productive function of shame. It's one that you could argue keeps tribes and families and social organizations together. Um, Shame, the types of shame start to get at that extreme where the social bond is in danger of not being repaired. You get this threat of an unrepairable bond between the shamer, who could be an individual or even a generalized other, a society that has judged you and your low social class as shameable, and then being the one shamed. So being shamed, you experience being shamed as identifying with a transgression, being able to assess the value of not just doing wrong, but being wrong, being someone who is kind of more universally doing something that is a social construction, um, uh, so social transgression. And so it comes with more of this anxiety, deeper pain of shamefulness. And here you get those gestures of hiding away, removing yourself, hiding gestures, covering the face, not being seen as the one being shamed. And then the other side of that, the bypassing side, is shaming others, anger, being disrespectful to others, making a global judgment for the act or the situation, bodily stigma, social status, and picking, scapegoating one person within your group, rejecting someone from your group, or responding to being shamed by having anger or rage to reject the rejectors. These are all common responses. So, and this, to some extent, you could argue that shame and shaming is important to social organization and people being conforming to norms, keeping the tribe together, getting rid of threats. But you can see it also isn't always the most productive uh, way of maintaining social order or conformity. Um, the more you really have to rely on shaming people. But that's kind of the broader argument. Um, we certainly learn early in life to experience these negative emotions, but luckily there's Tom Scheff points out that there's a positive side, which is the other reason perhaps that that it does work for social organization is that actually repairing the bond, bringing it back together, is another composite emotions, which Tom Scheff calls pride, the pride family. It may not be the best word, but it's pretty good. It's the shifting back from distance to closeness, the repairing of the bond, repairing the social bond threat may have a corresponding positive, pleasurable experience within us that sometimes it's hard to kind of pinpoint it. We might feel joy at the security of once the bond is repaired. You'll see gestures such as smiling or laughter, which can be shared, eye contact as being the experience of this positive return to the secure social bond. I think play, um, those emotions are relevant. Um, you have this reward for being compliant to the social roles that work as you're playing and rehearsing with people in a social context. So as you return to a secure bond, you feel self confidence, you feel esteem, you feel a sense of purpose. This is kind of the play family of emotions. And I think love is in there too. Uh, the return to a secure mate, a secure family, parental bond, but also a tribe, solidarity of a social organization is a kind of a form of love he can experience as peacefulness, connectedness, affiliation, um, and um, um, even respect and gratitude as you come back into kind of even the relationships that aren't always healthy, differences in power and hierarchy, um, are nevertheless ones that might feel comfortable and give this sense of pride in this composite sense. So the repairing of the social bond is a repairing of social organization as well. Um, so I think we've argued for why there may be something special about this particular family of composite emotions that are important for social organization. But when I was studying it, I like to, and Tom Scheff made this point as well, that these emotions aren't just kind of separate from talk, doing their own thing. He argued that they're really constitutive of talk, and I think we could see that they literally make talk and conversation possible by having as part of it this constant adjustment of the social bond, and if not actual shame family emotions, at least on the boundaries, those shame family emotions are ready to pop up and become impulses. And so there's always kind of a predictive aspect of how not to get yourself too far out of social expectations, even as you talk, and how to maintain that during talk, which is done, I think, largely through the kind of gestures that are always part of language. Prosody, meaning tone of voice, gestures that we use as we talk, they're still there. Um, this comes from before we learn to talk as infants. There you can watch mother and an infant interact as a sequence of looking and looking away, looking and looking away, and as they learn to crawl, moving away, moving back. Um, this becomes an aspect of social self, social stance, social distance that becomes first embodied in how they move and look, and then as they learn words, become symbolic. Maintaining the quality of the social relationships is there in their first words. It's always about the caretakers and things like that, things that are important. So um, but I think we could make as a stronger claim that as language evolves, it's still there. It's still part of constituting the boundaries of relevance, realized and at the boundaries of mutual understanding even if you're using a word that you expect someone else to understand, at the boundaries of that or the expectation that our relationship is based even on me at this moment saying, oh, there it is. And you need to be able to understand what I'm referring to by it as well as I do. And if you don't, then I need to do something to repair that because I'm accountable to that mutual understanding. And that's actually maintaining a social relationship. And I think this goes right into the brain. That the brain is organized using neuronal groups to do this kind of work as kind of internalization of this external conversation being what allows our brain to do language within itself. So um, that's a little vague, but I guess I could briefly tie it to how social relationships are um, part of talk and interaction in the ways I've talked about in some of our other interactions, where if you look closely at conversation, you'll see people operate at least three levels. One is topical, what they talk about. You could look at their references. So people are always talking about I, me in relation to self and other. Certainly is a common conversation of talk, both directly and by implicature, as you talk about social organizations and abstract things. But then conversationally, there's lots of little mechanics that we talked about in the past. Turn taking, coordinating who talks next. When can you interrupt someone or talk over someone? How does a question follow an answer or an answer follow a question? How is this a particular type of social organization? All of these are constraints for achieving talk at the moment, but also the relationships that are done through talk and warranting the relevance of talk using the structure. So if you want to shame someone, you have to do it conversationally. Um, you can punch someone in the face, but shaming generally involves a little more conversation than that. Um, and so that's why I put relational as one of the three components of talk, along with topical and conversational stance, accountability, quality of social bond, the self other relationships realized. Um, all of these have this shame family of emotions there around the edges as the impulse for what's evaluated, what's considered a threat, what's repaired, and how it's done. Um, and so this is a, um, I won't go into this too much, but I talked a little bit about five operational elements of what I call social inaction that create this relevance for social bond as well. We do things in our talk that allow recognition by other people uh, of certain things distinguished from a background. So the bond, social bond, becomes realized by making it recognizable to others, by saying things that allow others to predict aspects of the bond quality, threats, emotional consequences anticipated by what we say and project to others. And within conversation, we're always assessing, evaluating, usually based on what someone did just before you in a conversation. So, what someone just said, you're listening and evaluating, not just for the words and what they mean, but what does it matter for the social bond and what potentially might be shame or shaming. Um, and then conversationally having methods of adjustment, being able to repair the troubles, not just troubles of meaning, but also troubles of the bond threat. This is done through talk. And then, as a broader category, what I call accountability is this more general sense of being able to warrant what someone does now by what someone ought to do based on wider social context, the whole history of human organization and social norms that are encoded into talk also become the basis of how we evaluate our social relationships and bonds at any moment. Um, so, uh, so just as a little side note, AI can't do this. AI, large language models, they are doing something with no social bond involved, I argue.
Aha.
They
You found
pretend.
something then,
Yeah.
huh?
They and if they figure out how to do this, maybe we need to be worried, but I think it's interesting is how well they can mimic it and how they kind of have to mimic social bonds. And you'll see this kind of worked into the way they talk about, hey, great answer, great question, Dave. Here's what I found, you know. But they are um, what they're doing mechanically is just doing programs that um, create predictive probabilities of certain words or phrases going together, and maybe certain social uh, 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 um, social bond related aspects of things that go together, like praise someone after they ask a question is a rule, but it's different. We're talking about something else that the brain's doing. And it's something that doesn't sustain itself well without having grown up in a world that is first emotional and then social, I think. So we'll see if someone can figure out how to do that with AI, but let's not hope it's right away. Um, all right. I know we've been at it quite a while.
I
But
know I'm concerned about your voice, but this is this is really an amazing companion. And are we getting close to where uh, the your slides end?
no.
Oh
But
boy.
maybe we'll end up with a part two.
Well, we
But
can do that.
let me just at least get through the the social bond part, and then maybe as a part two, we'll talk about how this extends into a very interesting therapy. Um,
Yeah.
so the work I did based on working with social with Tom Scheff and Suzanne Retzinger, they they talked about the bond threat. I applied it. They had applied it to close analysis of interaction. I did that as well for my master's thesis, looking at what I did was I gave people, I took a standard self-esteem questionnaire and I asked people the questions live while sitting there in an interview. And so they had to answer the questions in front of me. So they would talk about things that might be a threat to their social, to, threat, troublesome social situations, things that made them feel bad. And so in telling me, they're both um, demonstrating the, a potential threat to the social bond with me as the interviewer, because I might be evaluating what they say, but also talking about threatening situations in the past, both of which can trigger immediate shame family um, feelings. And that was my hypothesis. And so doing so, I took the transcripts and the video and looked at all their gestures and tones of voice and found a very particular sequence that that I think at least demonstrated the relationships of talk and social bond with this composite emotions as part of it. So, and I call it the bond threat sequence. Um, First, you get people orient to the bond threat. You get an impulse from this shame family of emotions. And then there's adjustment to that impulse using the social bond. So they're adjusting the conditions of the threat to the social bonds to deal with the feelings. And this is done with a sequence of uh, first orienting to the threat. You can they show evidence of feeling the feelings through their gestures and their words and their behaviors. And then they do something to repair the social bond, which relieves some of those feelings. And you could see this. It's not just a hypothesis. You could see them doing this in talk. So the overt, and I looked at both overt and bypassing, and I'll show some examples of those, and that we can close up after that. So overt shame behaviors are the blushing, touching the face, nervous laugh, uh, things that are the equivalent of hiding. Um, So here is a example of this was done so long ago that it might as
Mhm.
well be public domain. But as far as IRB is concerned, but I did get permission to share these. But th- this is a student who's talking about a relationship with a male friend who seems like could be a boyfriend, but they don't seem to be committed to be as a boyfriend girlfriend. So what you see is overt shame as she talks about it. And I'll play it and then point out what's going on.
We are in a way like the way we act around each other, but then there's like no commitment or whatsoever. And I guess if I wanted to master a situation, I could bring it up and say, well, what's going on here? Why, you know, should we be committed to each other or whatever? But I don't really, and I'm not sure that I don't think I want that anyway. So I guess I haven't really wanted to.
So you could see,
Mhm.
as she starts to speak, I guess if I wanted to master a situation, I could bring it up. So she's orienting to a threat. The threat is if I wanted to confront this person and say, "Are you my boyfriend or not?" It becomes kind of a relationship threat that she's talking about. And as she talks about it, she um, has a more rapid voice, but then averts her eyes and lowers her head and becomes a softer voice, kind of a verbal means of
We
of
are in a
hiding.
way like the way we act around each other, but then there's like no commitment or whatsoever. And I guess if I wanted to master a
She's
situation,
now
I could bring
looking
it up and
down.
say, well, what's going on here?
She's looking at
Why,
my eyes
you know,
when she's talking about the
should we be committed
relationship.
to each other or whatever?
And
But
then
I
when
don't
she says
really,
committed, she looks away
and I'm not sure that I don't think I want that anyway. So
and then
Has to chuckle.
lowers her head and touches her face right at that point. So the nervous laughter. So this was a quick example of someone um, now not just showing this overt shame, but also doing something about the relationship itself. So she said, if I wanted to master the situation, I could bring up and say, what's going on here? Should we be committed to each other or whatever? So as though the as it, saying essentially, if I were to try to repair this bond, but I'm not sure if I want to try to repair this bond. I don't think I wanted that anyway, so I guess I haven't really wanted to. So kind of justifying the bond distance after as a way of repairing in a way this overt shame talked about and also felt at that moment. So that's kind of that's one example of the sequence where overt shame comes up. I'll show you one.
really,
I'll show you one more where there's more of a bypassing uh, activity where you're doing things still orienting to a bond threat, but rather than as the feelings come up as you anticipate what they feel like, you do something to control those feelings, make them go away, and also adjust the social bond representation itself so that perhaps that which seems shaming isn't actually shaming. So the bypassing behaviors we'll see are things like stuttering or stammering, uh, kind of semi-dissociative of words to what was said just before, or doing things that shame others, or and some often with anger,
Mhm.
or to justify the distance that you have from others. So I'll show another example of this guy who is talking about a situation where when he's out with friends, his friends always ask him to make decisions about what to do and where to go to eat every night. And he's getting, he finds that to be a a threat because they're essentially judging him for his choices while not making choices on their own. So we'll see how he uses bypassing.
Like 5 times, and sooner or later, I mean, after a while, everybody's like, "What do you want to do, Dad?" And like that, like I was like the one always just imposing my opinion on them when they would make the decision, and so I would, and then so because of that, they thought I was like always pretty much telling them, "Let's do this," and getting my way, but it wasn't like that at all. They weren't enough. They didn't have enough to make their own decisions, so I had to impose my opinion. So they thought I was just being kind of pushy, but I wasn't. And that's why that's the only thing I can think of. Like 5 times.
So he you can see a little bit of his gestures. I'll play it real quick as he orients towards the what they thought of him. And so because of that, they thought I was always pretty much telling them, let's do this and getting my way. As he's telling that, he kind of stammers, lowers his head, has what's called a false smile, where he's smiling, but his eyes aren't smiling. It's kind of like a false pride, doesn't matter, that kind of thing.
Like 5 times, and sooner or later, I mean, after a while, everybody's like, "What do you want to do, Dad?" And like that, like I was like the one always
Exaggerated voice.
imposing my opinion on them when they
So
would
he-
make the decision, and so I would, and then so because of that, they thought I was like always pretty much telling them, "Let's do this," and
so-
getting my way, but it wasn't like that at all. They weren't enough. They didn't have
kind
enough
of
to
stutter, stammer,
make their own
disruption of
decisions,
voice.
so I had to impose my opinion.
And then he makes eye contact when he says, I had to inflict my own decision. So kind of repairing talking about a sort of repaired bond, one where he's justified the existence and also looking at me at the same time, saying, okay, this is not a shameful bond. So, so you can really see how people do this in the detail of their talk all the time. And a fun example at home is to, uh, if you're in the middle of an argument, try to pay attention to all the things you're doing at the moment while also trying to do the argument itself and see how that goes. I think you'll find that that's a little challenging, but it is something maybe where a little more awareness of what we're doing, especially to bypass our feelings rather than acknowledge them, may make a difference to how we do things for repairing the social bond in a more productive way. So we'll leave it at that. I'll give a little teaser for part 2, which I'll kind of go back and reiterate the bond threat sequence, having now thoroughly argued why there probably is such a thing as shame and bond threats in their relationship. And
I believe it now.
yeah, but what's interesting is there's maybe there's more to the social self than just a self who's shamed, a self entirely relying on other people to define what's shaming and what isn't. There's and how it, in psychology, certainly the family is looked at, childhood experiences of family as being a core to how we learn and are socialized around these feelings and its management. But there's an interesting area of therapeutic psychology called internal family systems therapy that poses the notion that we are not just orienting to external bonds, but we are made up of lots of little parts, selves, full I me selves to some degree, and we have social bonds internally and are managing internal social bonds, and the internal social bonds can be shaming each other and others are shamed. And and there's ways of therapeutically kind of having a conversation among these parts and relieving things that as children, as little children, seem to work to protect ourselves, but don't work as adults. And yet those little children parts are still there, trying to help, but doing so in very non-productive ways. So that's what we will focus on, and it will be a shorter talk, but it's one that I think will for for me, what it did was it filled in some gaps with Tom Scheff's theory about how social bonds are repaired or ought to be repaired, but really aren't in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
as well as one would think they would. So we'll talk a
All
bit
right.
about that.
I think let's hold that slide for the next time and go back on screen just for a minute to there's a word that I want to end up with and repeat afterwards from my mind, and that's the word bond. It's the feeling of being, we say, oh, I'm connected, but a bond is why you're connected, isn't it? I mean, the bond is much deeper and much more adhesive, if you will. And so you can feel, I assume you can feel when the bond's weakening.
Mm-hmm. That's the
And
idea.
that brings
the
up the
feeling.
shame and the pride. Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly the shame.
Yeah.
And the repair is trying to get it back to being so strong that it holds the two people, and two or more people together, so that across that bond or because of that bond, they can enact, they can listen to each other, they can think, they can correct and hold the bond while doing so.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, this is going to be fun to continue to explore. But I
Yeah.
want to congratulate you on the thoroughness of this presentation. And folks, we're going to make sure that because you listened and watched this long, that you're going to get the next part. Because I think that idea, intriguing idea, that we also fighting for bonds within us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it opens up. It's both scary and promising.
Yeah, it is. And that addresses the question that you started with, which is a comment you got was, I can't quite see how social inaction links to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, folks, how a question and a comment can move the thinker in a very positive direction, as long as he's not ashamed with the question.
Yeah.
And he wasn't. It was a matter of, oh yeah, that's a missing thought that I'm now going to have, and we're going to have a richer understanding of social inaction.
Yeah, and how it refers to practice and social organization, which reminds me, didn't you just re-release a little book that has
Aha.
conversations and social relationships? So
It's
well,
huge. It's a novel, and I intuitively, I think, as well as intellectually, put different relationships into the book with various distances, close between the mother and daughter, and almost, just so close, and the mother's and her mother, and then as we moved out through the company, the coworker scheme became less and less emphatic and less part of the story. But as she came back in and found a particular coworker who had been her supervisor and now had been relegated to the cubicle of shame, it brought it right back again, and also brought her feelings in. So yes, the book is Inside Knowledge, and it's now in digital form. And I'll make sure when we post this discussion that I put a link in there so you can take a look at it.
You can find the link on enactionresearch.info. Enactionresearch.info will have the link to the book, and it's one that anyone who works or is a manager or has been managed or has a job or wants a job or wants to reminisce about organizational life in the 80s that still applies today, or 90s I should say, then get this book. It's really,
there you go. Okay. Really you heard the pitch, folks, and I agree. Thank you again, Dave. Stay tuned for another one very soon. Thank you again.